The wind had a grind to it, a metal rasp as it raked the old mining road. Snow scudded sideways and hissed along the iron markers that once held lanterns for mule trains. Gideon Hale rode the ridge slow. Atlas snorted steam at every step, hooves biting into crust, lifting again with a small sound like breaking glass. He had come out for a missing pack horse. Tracks had braided and blown shut already, but a scuff at a switchback told him the animal had turned uphill. He clicked his tongue and let the big roan find the grade. Then the sound came too thin for the wind at first, almost a trick in the throat of the mountain. He held his breath. It came again, sharp and wet and high, the cry of a newborn cutting through the cold. He stopped listening and moved. Atlas shouldered through wind-carved drifts. A stand of scrub pine gave a moment of quiet, and in that hush he saw the shape. A woman hair stiff with ice tied upright to a cast iron post with telegraph wire. The wire had eaten stripes into her wrists and above her elbows. Her nightdress was torn and frozen to her legs. At the base of the post lay 3 bundles, the color of old flour sacks, bumping with small breath faces, chapped and gray at the lips. Gideon swung down. The cold took him by the teeth and shook. He slid his knife under the wire and twisted a small grunt each time the blade bit. He was careful not to saw. The wire let go in a flinch. The woman folded against him without weight. He shouldered her and felt bone under cloth, the dull heat of fever against his collar. He tucked the bundles, one against his shirt where his body heat would do the most good to under his coat at his ribs. The smallest gave a weak hitching gulp. Atlas stamped impatient with the storm. Gideon lifted the woman into the saddle and climbed up behind, bracing her with one arm and pinning the bundles with the other. He spoke into her ear because he had nothing else to offer. "Come on!" Atlas moved uphill like a machine. Wind threw white into their faces. Hoofprints vanished as soon as they made them. The cabin showed dark through blown snow, a square of pine logs set back from the road, a black mouth where a door should be. He kicked the door with his heel, and it swung in and clapped the wall. Snow rolled over the threshold and spread across the plank floor. Cold lived inside the walls like another animal. The hearth held a drift of ash and a few dull coals. A table, 2 chairs, a cot pulled near the stone, 3 pegs by the door with a coat, a hat, a rifle wrapped in oiled cloth. He laid the woman on the cot as if she were made of thin glass. Her head tipped to the side. Her lips were cracked white. The 3 small bodies he placed in a wicker basket he had lined months ago with sheepskin and not used. He stripped his gloves and worked with hands that had split wood and held rope and could if he let them crack a green branch with a twist. He did not let them. He went to work on the fire. Kindlings stacked like a small house he had built 100 times. A twist of bark. A spark. The first thread of flame. He fed it slow so it would not run out of breath. Heat crawled from the stones of the hearth and touched his face. On the shelf above the table sat a glass jar of goat's milk. He set it by the fire and watched it take the edge off. He found the small spoon in the wooden box behind the stove. It was maple worn smooth. He had carved it for a niece who never lived a full day. The handle fit his fingers because he had made it to. He did not think about that. He dipped and tested against his wrist and touched the spoon to a tiny mouth. It opened, took, swallowed. He moved to the next. Then the next. He wiped their mouths with the back of his sleeve. He loosened their wraps and tightened them again. He laid each small palm against his throat for a second to feel the flutter and told himself it was enough. He turned to the woman. He found the tin basin and brought water to a simmer and poured it to warm his cloth. He washed blood that had dried black. He did not pull at the skin under the wire marks. He cut strips from a clean shirt and bound her wrists and forearms. She did not stir. He took the elk hide from the cedar chest and spread it over her and tucked it under her feet. It shed a faint animal smell that the cabin took in and kept. He sat near the fire with his legs long and his hands flat on his thighs. He stayed that way until he heard a sound he could not name. He turned. Her eyes were open a slit. Her lips shaped words that did not come at first. When they did, they were a dry scrape. I did what I was told. I kept quiet. I cooked. I said yes. He never changed. I gave him girls. He made me a sin for it. He did not answer. He went to the corner where his axe leaned, lifted it, and set a split of pine on the block. He brought the blade down. The lodgepole gave a sound like a sentence stopping. He split again. Each time the blade found the grain and went through. The air filled with the sweet, clean throat of sap. He fed the fire and did it again. Her breathing found a pace that did not climb and fall. The babies made small animal sounds and slept limbs loose as water. He kept the rhythm. The only words in the room were the ones he made with steel and wood. He worked until the fire was not a small thing but a steady one. He set the axe aside. He went to close the door and dragged a wet broom through the snow that had drifted across the floor. He hung his coat and hat. He checked the pegs again out of habit, fingertips skimming the brim. As he moved the coat, a small square fell from an inner pocket and hit the floor without a sound. He bent and picked up the folded cloth. Blue. Faded. A single letter sewn in one corner in neat, careful thread. R. He stared at it a second, then put it back in the pocket and pushed the coat against the peg until it did not want to fall again. He took the basket closer to the hearth so the heat could wrap it without biting. He sat with his back to the stones and the 3 small breaths in his ears. He reached into the kindling basket and found a length of aspen he had kept because it felt right in the hand. He drew his knife and shaved the first curl from it. The curl coiled on the floor like a white ribbon. Another curl. The blade sang a little when it came toward him. He did not know what he meant to make. He wanted the sound. Outside, the wind stepped down. The house listened. Snow hit the window in a soft patter instead of a slap. He stood and lifted the latch. The night was a wall. Sound moved through it in a long seam. Atlas shook himself, and the halter rang once. Far below, beyond the black of the spruce, a horse stamped on frozen mud, and the echo climbed the slope. He shut the door and set the bar. He went to the cot. The woman's eyes were open. He poured a little water and lifted her head and held it so she could drink. She swallowed in jerks, then let him ease her down again. He saw her look swing from the rafters to the basket to his face and stick there a moment like a burr on a blanket. "His name is Gideon," she said, voice soft and frayed as if the letters hurt. "Hers is Lena." He nodded once. "Do not let them take my girls." It was not a plea, it was a stone. He did not say, "I promise." He said, "You are in my house." The fire sent a low crack through the room. Smoke climbed and thinned at the roof seam. He laid more wood by the hearth so he would not have to cross the room for it. He took the aspen again and shaved it to a clean shape a little longer than his palm. His knife moved and the curl pile deepened at his boot. The babies breathed. The woman stared at the ceiling until her eyes slid shut and stayed that way. Wind shifted. He smelled it lift from the valley, a different cold damp with the river touched by bay rum. With it a thin tremor in the dark, a string pulled tight and plucked, hooves faint measured. Lena's eyes opened at once as if a wire had been tied to them. She turned to the door without moving her head. Her lips barely moved. They will be back before dawn. Dawn did not hurry. The dark thinned, then filled back in as if the mountain changed its mind. Gideon kept the fire working because the room wanted to go cold the moment he stopped. He fed the flame in small, careful bites. He checked the babies by touch a palm to a cheek, 2 fingers to a throat breath felt more than seen. The smallest slept with her mouth open. The middle one rolled a hand as if catching something in a dream. The oldest grimaced and then let go. Lena watched the ceiling with eyes that slipped in and out of focus. Every so often her gaze found the basket held there, then drifted. Her lips had color again. He cleaned the wire marks when the water looked right. He did not talk much while he worked. When he needed her to drink, he said her name and raised the tin cup. She swallowed, coughed, once nodded. The light finally bled into the seams of the roof. He opened the door a hand's width and swept snow out with the wet broom. The world outside had the blue of cold iron. Atlas shook and snorted. Somewhere lower, a creak made a hard sound under ice. He went along the inside walls and touched every seam like a stable hand checking straps. The window frames had a draft. He pulled elk hide from a chest and tacked it with square nails along the sills. The hide dulled the light and kept the room from biting. At the door he set a second bar across the inside, a length of axled pin he had pried out of an old ore cart. It fit like it belonged, and the hinge answered with a thick click. He crossed to the shed and lifted the floor plank he had cut long ago. Hard dirt showed where he'd taken a shovel to it last summer. He worked a short spade in tight bites and set the dirt in a bucket. The air in the hole rose wet and cold. He laid wolf pelts fur up so the cold would not eat the small ones. He tested the fit of the plank and made sure it sat with no telltale rock. When he came back into the cabin, his hands carried the smell of earth. Lena watched him fix the plank in place and swallowed. Her voice came and stopped and then came again. "You are building a place to hide." He knelt by the hole and set the last strip of pelt edges flush. He nodded without looking up. "For them, you do not even know me." He touched the edge of the plank, tested it, then turned and met her eyes. "I do not save people to stay safe. I save them because I cannot stand the thought of someone being left behind." She looked back to the ceiling. Her face went quiet in a way that was not empty. She drew the elk hide closer to her chin and closed her eyes for a while. By mid-morning, the room held a steady heat. He made small food from what lay handy. A pot of beans set to bubble at the edge of the fire. Coffee boiled black and rough. He took the goat milk down to a warmth his wrist could bear and fed the babies again. When Lena tried to lift the spoon, he shook his head. She lowered her hand and let herself breathe. He set the cot higher on blocks so the draft would not pool under her. He hung his coat and hat and checked the rifle he had rubbed with oil. He wrapped the rifle again and set it back on the peg. He looked at it a long second and then away. The door rattled once. A gloved fist hammered the jamb without ceremony. Gideon lifted the bar and opened to a woman's small and sharp-eyed coat patched at the elbows boots, white with snow. Agnes Crowley brushed past him and took off her gloves on the move. She shot him a look that had the weight of years. "You gonna let an old woman drop from frost, or have you got manners left?" Gideon stepped aside. The heat touched her face, and she sighed once without softening. Her eyes took the room fast. The hearth, the cot, the basket. She moved to the babies, pressed the back of a finger to each brow, listened to the wetness in their chests, nodded. She looked at Lena, and something in her shoulders set. "Names," Agnes said. Lena's mouth opened. She had to shape the air a moment before sound came. Ivy, May, Pearl. Agnes gave Gideon a look that was not a question, but held one anyway. He bent to the wood box, took out 3 thin pieces of aspen he had kept for nothing in particular. He sat on the low stool by the door and drew his knife. The room filled with the sound of a blade talking to wood. He cut each letter in a hand that was plain and steady. Ivy, May, Pearl. He rubbed a little oil on each and held them to the fire long enough to bring the grain forward. He nailed them high on the wall above the basket, 3 small names set in a line. Agnes watched him work and let the corner of her mouth lift. About time somebody said them out loud. She went on with her errand. She pulled bread from her bag, a heel wrapped in cloth, and put it on the table. She fished out a cone of sugar and a small jar of pennyroyal and set them beside the coffee as if she owned the place. Then she turned to Gideon. "Randall Pike is telling half the valley she went mad, says she ran off with his children and tried to drown him in the river. He has Judge Caswell's paper in his pocket and 2 men riding at his back who do the thinking with their gun hands." Lena's fingers closed around the edge of the elk hide. The words made a flat sound in her throat. "He will take them." Agnes did not waste her eyes on fear. She kept them on Gideon. "He will try." Gideon nodded once. He did not put his hand on the rifle. He went to the shed, brought in a hammer and a coil of wire, and hung a small bell under the porch roof so it barely cleared the plank. He tied a strip of rawhide to its tongue and ran the rawhide through a ring by the door, where his fingers would find it in the dark. He set a second bar at the back window, a length of wagon spoke he had shaped with a draw knife. Lena watched him move and pressed her lips together, color coming into her face and then draining. She spoke with the words spaced like stones in a line. "He is a man people listen to." Gideon tested the bell with a finger. It gave a round, small sound that cut the room. He let the rawhide go. He looked at Lena and said without heat, No one takes a child from my house, Agnes snorted. Gospel from a quiet man. She stepped toward the door and stood with her hand on the frame. She listened to the air beyond, as if she could hear tracks. Her mouth flattened. They left town at first light, 3 of them. Not the kind that knock. Gideon's jaw worked once. He lifted the small stool to the hearth and set Lena's feet on it. He put another log on the fire and watched the flame find it then turn clean. He brought the spoon and the jar of milk. When he fed the smallest, Lena's eyes filled in a sudden spill that did not reach her mouth. She wiped at them with the heel of her hand and let her hand rest at her throat. She looked at the names on the wall and touched the blanket at her chest, a small grip as if to anchor. Agnes watched her and nodded once to herself. She stepped over to the table and poured coffee without asking. She drank it black and harsh and set the cup down hard enough to speak. If he comes with paper, I will read it. If he comes with lies, I will speak louder. Sheriff Rourke owes my shop a roof, and my mouth is loud enough to wake him. Lena's eyes found Agnes and softened. Thank you. Do not spend it all in thanks, dear heart. Keep your breath for the hard parts. Agnes moved to the door and tugged her gloves back on. She gave Gideon one last look. Say a word if you want something. Otherwise, I will bring what my head thinks of. She stepped into the white and pulled the door to. The latch caught with a sound like a small lock. Silence settled again, but it was not empty. It carried Agnes's words and set them on the shelf with the bread. Gideon cleared the table to the wood, wiped it with a damp cloth, and set a neat line of things where a hand might reach blind. Lamp, matches, knife. He laid the aspen shavings in the tinder box because even fine curls would kindle again if asked. He picked up a plank from the corner and marked a cut. The saw sang low as it bit. The baby stirred at the sound and then eased again. Lena turned her head toward the saw and then toward the door. Her eyes had the far look a person gets when memory sits very near. When she spoke, it came like the start of a story she did not want to tell but could not leave alone. His mother said my body was a curse. Said I spoiled his name with girls. She tied the wire herself. Gideon stopped the saw and set it down. He did not touch her. He said Lena. She looked at him as if waking. Her mouth pressed shut and she nodded once. He did not ask for more. He ripped the plank clean and carried the half to the window and wedged it under the bar so the frame would not shiver in a gust. The afternoon pulled the light thin. The shadows climbed the walls. The room grew a color that felt like the inside of a pine. Gideon sat and took the spoon again. He fed the middle one while the oldest slept with a fist spread on her cheek. He tucked the basket closer and felt the heat come back off the stones. A chill draft spoke at the floorboards. He stood and checked the door. The rawhide line lay still. He put his ear against the wood and heard only the close sound of snow falling on a roof. He turned to the room and his eyes found the 3 names high on the wall. The letters had darkened with the oil and looked old already. He let himself look at them a long time. He was halfway to the chair when the bell outside gave one clear ring. The bell sounded once bright and clean, then went still. Gideon did not look at Lena. He crossed the room and set his hand on the rawhide line so it would not chatter again. He lifted the bar and opened the door enough to see the yard. Snow had a crust that held light like glass. Atlas stood with his head high and ears cut to a point. Down the track a rider showed as a dark seed in the white and then split into 3. Gideon closed the door and set the bar again. He checked the fire, then the basket, then the pegs by the door. He took the coat and did not put it on. His hands were steady. Lena drew the elk hide up and slid her feet under her. She did not ask him to wait. Her fingers found the edge of the cot and held there. She watched him without blinking. The bell gave a softer shiver. Hooves ground ice. Harness rang. When the knock came, it was not on the door. It was the butt of a rifle against the frame, 3 hard blows that shook dust from the boards. Gideon lifted the bar and stepped out. Cold crawled into his shirt in one move. The sun had not cleared the ridge, and the men looked cut from the same dim light. Randall Pike sat straight in a coat of dark fur. His mustache was neat. His gloves were new. To his right, the short man with the heavy shoulders let his rifle rest against his thigh. The tall one sat crooked in the saddle, a scar like a white root above his eye. Randall smiled as if they were neighbors. "Morning, Mr. Hale." Gideon stood with his feet on the top step and his hands at his sides. "I am here for my wife," said Randall, "and my children. The law says they belong to me." He reached inside his coat and drew a folded paper sealed with red wax. He held it up without coming closer. Judge Caswell's order. Nora Pike hysterical and unfit. Immediate return to her lawful home. Gideon did not look at the paper. He kept his eyes on Randall's face. Randall let the paper drop to his knee. He moved his gaze past Gideon into the dark of the doorway where the smell of warm milk and ash came and went. He took a small breath that showed the bay rum even at this distance. "You have something of mine, Mr. Hale." He made it light. "You can hand it out now and save everyone a ride back." Gideon spoke low. "No one here is a thing." The short man spat into the snow. He squinted up at Gideon as if sight could push. "You deaf big man." The tall one tapped the stock of his rifle against his boot, then brought it up to his shoulder and let it settle again. His eyes did not blink much. The scar moved when he frowned. Randall's smile thinned. He tucked the paper into his coat. He swung his leg over and dropped to the snow. His boots did not sink far. He walked forward with his pistol-sheathed hands easy at his sides. He stopped 2 paces from the first step. "She is mine," he said. "You fed her your coffee and warmed her feet. I see that. Good of you. Now move." Gideon came down 1 step. They stood near enough to feel each other's breath smoke and break. Gideon kept his voice even. "She is not a piece of land. She is not yours." Randall's jaw clicked and then went quiet again. He lifted a hand in a lazy half-circle. "There was a time I would have been grateful for a neighbor's kindness. That time passed when she took what is mine and ran." A sound slipped behind Gideon. He did not turn. He knew the feel of quiet when someone came to the door and stood in its throat. Lena's breath made a small fog at his back. He flicked his eyes once down and saw bare toes at the threshold, white against the plank. Randall's gaze slid beyond him and caught on Lena. It held a second and hardened. He took 1 step up. The short man's rifle rose a fraction in a reflex, then settled. Gideon said, "Stop." Randall stopped. His voice lost the smile. "Move aside." "No." The short man came in fast, rifle held flat. The butt drove into Gideon's left shoulder. The sound was a dull crack, and the world went white at the edge. He took a half step back and found the post. The shoulder sagged and would not answer. Warmth ran under his shirt and down his ribs. Atlas screamed and jerked his head in the halter. The tall man laughed once without humor. The second blow came before his body could learn the first. It took him near the collar and tore cloth. He did not go down. He put his right hand on the porch post and set his boots like wedges. His left arm hung loose. He breathed and tasted blood and iron. Randall watched his face as if reading a note. He shook his head once in pity that did not reach his eyes. "This is foolish." Lena's voice came from behind Gideon, thin but clear. "Randall." He glanced up. For a moment, he looked like any man who hears his name in a place he does not own. His mouth opened the width of a coin and shut again. "You tied the wire," Lena said. "You and your mother." Randall's mouth smiled. "Words from a sick woman," he said. "The law knows better." Gideon did not look at her. He let his body be the wall and held the door with his shoulder where the pain did not live. He saw the short man shift weight into his heels. The tall man took his rifle back into the pocket of his shoulder and watched Gideon's good side with a lazy patience. The horses stamped and blew. Randall took the paper again and held it high, then dropped his arm. He reached down for his pistol and let it rest in his hand without raising it. "You make this hard, Mr. Hale. I will not say please again." Gideon said, "I heard you." They stood without moving. The cold chewed the edges of Gideon's vision and gave them back. He could feel the heat behind him and the soft whisper of a child breathing. He let that tell him where to stand. Randall took the last step. He stood on the porch too near for a shot that would miss. He smoothed the fur of his coat with 2 fingers, as if to wipe off the air of the place. He looked Gideon full in the face. There was a kind of wonder in his eyes, a man watching his own measure taken and not liking the length. The tall man shifted his rifle. The short one lifted the butt again for a 3rd hit. Gideon did not move. He saw a dark shape on the trail far below where the spruce broke, and the road ran like a gray seam. The shape was small and quick and then gone. A metal note rode the wind from the valley, thin and long as if something iron had been struck and left to sing. Lena said nothing more. She stood behind Gideon with Pearl in her arms and the elk hide sliding from one shoulder. Her eyes were dry and flat and strong. He could feel that look on his spine like a hand. Randall lifted his pistol and set it on Gideon's chest. The hammer clicked back. The hammer clicked back and held. Metal pressed through Gideon's shirt. Cold found the place where heat had lived and put its teeth there. He did not blink. A voice came up the track flat and carrying, "Drop the gun, Pike." The men on the porch turned their heads as one. Sheriff Miles Rourke rode in with a small knot of steam around his horse. Deputy Ben Cutter kept to his flank reins, tight eyes on the tall rifleman. Agnes Crowley sat a stubborn mule like a judge, skirt stiff with frost jaw set. Randall did not lower the pistol. He smiled without showing teeth. "Morning, Sheriff. You are here to help a man with his family business." The sheriff halted 10 paces out. His badge caught what little light the morning gave. "No, I am here on county business." He tipped his chin at Lena behind Gideon, her wrists. Now. Agnes was already moving. She swung down and cut straight for the door. Her boots bit the steps. She looked once at Gideon's shoulder and once at Lena's face. Then she lifted Lena's hands and turned them to the light. The skin showed the bite of wire purple over green scabbed in narrow tracks. Agnes held them up so the yard could see. "She did not do that to herself," Agnes said. Her voice had no edges. "You tied a woman to iron in a mountain storm." Randall's mouth worked. Lies. Deputy Cutter had his rifle to his shoulder, pointed low and steady at the snow between Randall's boots. He spoke without raising his voice. "Shorty Cobb, Lank Dugan, keep the iron where I can see it." The tall man's eyes slid to the timberline and back. The short one flexed his hands around the rifle stock and spat. "Nobody shot anything, Deputy." Randall let the barrel ease from Gideon's chest. He took one careful step back. He lifted the paper again like a shield and shook it once. "Judge Caswell says she is unfit. That is the law that stands." Sheriff Rourke did not take the paper. He looked at Randall as a man might look at a crooked fence he would rather jump than mend. "The order says words. What I see is wire marks and frostbite and babies." He turned his horse half a step so the badge flashed again. "Put the gun down." Randall's eyes flicked to the street below, to the badge, to Agnes's fingers on Lena's wrists. He set his jaw. He moved the pistol 2 inches lower. The short man twitched first. The rifle came up. He brought the butt around toward Gideon's shoulder for the third and finishing hit. Gideon met it with his good hand and caught the stock. The jolt shot fire through his arm, but the wood stopped. The tall man's rifle snapped up to fire. Ben Cutter's horse bit the bit and surged. He leaned and batted the barrel sideways with his own stock. The shot tore a handful of shingles off the eave and sprayed cedar. Atlas reared and struck air. Splinters pattered the yard like dry hail. The sheriff's rifle spoke once, not at a man. He sent a round into the snow between Randall's boots, so close it burned steam. The sound cracked and echoed off the trees. He leveled the muzzle at Randall's chest. Enough. Shorty froze with the butt still in Gideon's grip. His eyes moved, not his head. Lank lifted his hands from the rifle and let it drop into the snow where it stood at a tilt like a stake sapling. Ben slid from his saddle in a smooth swing and kicked the tall man's rifle away. He was on Shorty before the short man remembered to breathe, twisted the arm, and took the gun clean. The motion made a small, hard sound like a knot giving up in green wood. Randall looked smaller on the porch than he had on the horse. He held the pistol by habit more than choice. Sheriff Rourke eased his horse 2 steps closer until there was no space left that might confuse the matter. "Attempted murder," the sheriff said. "Assault, neglect of infants." He kept the charges simple and left them hanging in the cold. "Hand me the gun." Randall's eyes found Lena again. He showed her a softness that might have lived somewhere once. Then it went out. He turned the pistol and set it in his palm muzzle down. The sheriff took it and holstered it without breaking eye contact. He nodded to Ben. "Cuffs." Ben snapped iron around Randall's wrists and did not bother to be gentle. He swept the short man's ankles and took him down and tied him before the curse got up off the short man's tongue. Lank did not fight. He stood with his hands open the whole time like a man who had played the scene in his mind and hated the ending, but knew it by heart. Agnes let go of Lena's hands and looked hard at Gideon. The left shoulder had slipped low. The shirt collar had gone dark where the blood had taken its own path. She pressed her mouth thin and then lifted the elk hide back over Lena's feet. Gideon did not move until Randall took his first step away from the porch. Only then did Gideon breathe out the breath he had forgotten to trade for another. The breath came ragged and stuck at the broken place in his body. He kept his feet. Randall turned his head and tried for a last word. "The law is mine," he said. His voice cracked cold. The sheriff answered with a small shake of the head. "The law is the county's. The county is not your house." Agnes took one step forward and planted herself at the edge of the porch like a marker. Her voice came low so the wood would hear it and remember. "You will not write this as madness when you get to town. You will not forget the wire or the ice." She did not wait for an answer. She swung up to her mule and pulled her scarf tight. They started down. Hooves beat a slow measure on the crust. The tall man limped the iron on his wrists, bright the line between him and the deputy tight. The short man swore under his breath until Ben jerked him once and the words died. Randall kept his chin up like a man walking through rain with company watching. Silence settled against the cabin as the sound fell away. The crust of snow shone and then dulled. The bell under the porch stirred once then stilled. Gideon leaned his right shoulder against the post and closed his eyes. His left arm would not answer. Heat ran down into his boot. The world tilted and returned. A small weight came to his side. Lena stood there barefoot in the snow Pearl held against her shoulder. Her skin had the pale of milk, but her eyes were bright as flint. She looked up at him and set the baby into his good arms so the child's heat could climb his chest. "You did not raise your hand," she said. The words were simple, not praise. He looked down at her. The pain was a wide river over stones. His voice came slow. "I did not need to." She nodded once. She tilted her head at the door. Inside. He let her guide him in. The room met him with warm air and smoke and the smell of milk and pine. He set Pearl in the basket, laid a hand on each small belly, and counted to 3. His knees wanted the floor. He found the chair and took it without grace. The room moved and then steadied. Agnes came in last and pushed the door with her heel. She went to the stove without asking and set a small pot on water hissed at iron. She opened a drawer and found a strip of harness leather that had been waiting for no good reason. She set it on the table by Gideon's hand. "Shoulder is out," Agnes said. The words were a simple fact. "We will put it back." Lena crossed to the basin and dipped a cloth. She wrung it clean and came to Gideon. Her palms were sure now. She looked at him because men look away at the wrong time when they think of pain. He looked back at her and did not move his eyes. Agnes stood at his bad side and laid her hand above the joint. Her fingers read the bone and the stubborn muscle and the angle of the limb. She nodded once to herself. She lifted the leather toward Gideon's mouth. He took it between his teeth and closed his jaw. The cabin held a stillness that felt like the inside of a held breath. The fire cracked once and went quiet again. The bell did not ring. Snow ticked at the window and fell away. Lena put her hand on his good shoulder and leaned her weight into him to keep him from following the pain when it came. Her lips moved and he felt the word more than heard it. "Hold, hold," Lena said, and the word steadied the room. Agnes set her hand and pulled as she pressed. The joint slid and clacked home. Pain burst and went thin at the edges. Gideon bit down on the leather and let his breath find a new path. When the world settled, he tasted salt and iron and ash. Agnes touched the point of the shoulder and nodded once. "There, keep it still tonight." Lena wrung the cloth and laid it cool over the skin that had gone hot and angry. She stayed close in the chair beside him, as if distance were something a person had to relearn. The baby stirred and made small sounds like birds under leaves. The fire burned in a low, clean line. Agnes poured a little coffee into a cup and braced it with her palm while Gideon drank. Her voice came softer now, edges dulled by work well done. "I will send a boy to Rourke with word of your shoulder. Keep the door latched. Feed the little ones often." She looked at Lena and let a line of pride show, then gathered her gloves and was gone into the white. The bell did not ring when the door closed. Night grew itself in the rafters. The mountains stopped speaking in gusts and returned to the small sounds that told a house it was still on its footing. Gideon dozed and woke the pain, a high wire that quieted when Lena's hand found his good forearm and rested there. He watched the names above the basket catch the orange wash of the coals and go dark and glow again. Before first light, Lena set the kettle to clean water and shaved a strip of wild onion into it with a small knife. The smell rose sharp and alive. She mashed it with bear fat in a tin until it turned pale and smooth. She unwrapped the shoulder, worked the salve with careful circles, bound it again, and tied the cloth true. When she was done, she wiped her hands and sat back and let herself look at him without hurry. "You kept us warm," she said. He looked at the basket. "I kept the fire." She let out a breath that had waited behind her teeth and tipped her head as if that answer was right enough. Days held. The room learned a new rhythm. Morning came blue, then gold on the floorboards. The babies' chests lifted better. The cough left their sleep and did not come back. Ivy watched the curve of Gideon's spoon and followed it with her eyes like a hawk tracks a trout. May clutched his thumb and would not surrender it until she forgot she had it. Pearl laughed without sound and shook her fist like a sprig of willow. Lena found work that matched her strength and made it larger. She boiled cloth until the water ran clear. She cut narrow bands from a worn shirt and rolled them tight. She set the spoon and the jar where Gideon's right hand would reach without looking. Often she did not speak at all. Often he answered anyway by setting wood on the fire before she asked or moving the basket 3 inches nearer to the hearth when the draft turned. The shoulder behaved if he did. He tied it close with a strip of torn sheet and wore it like a sash. He carried small loads in the right hand and left the big ones for time. He went out under a sky that had the look of tin and took down a deadfall lodged in the creek. He came back wet to the knees and laughing once under his breath at the way ice could pick a man's path for him. Lena shook her head, but the corner of her mouth could not help itself. On the third day, he cleared the workbench by the window and set his pocket knife in the light like a tool on a table in a church. He chose a slim length of aspen and cut a bead the size of a robin's egg. He cut another. He let the blade find a rhythm that did not wake the babies. When he had 3, he burned a letter into each with a wire warmed in coals. Ivy, May, Pearl. He strung them on rawhide and rubbed a little oil in so they would gleam like small stones after rain. He turned the last piece of wood in his hand and cut a heart as if it were only another oval, then shifted the knife a hair and made a point. He hollowed it just enough to hold light. He burned a single letter in the middle. L. He threaded it and shook the string once so the beads sang against each other, a dry, low sound like seeds in a pod. Lena stood in the doorway of the shed and watched him finish. She did not step forward right away. He lifted the string without looking, and she came the way a person comes to a window open to spring. He set the beads in her palm and let his fingers fall back. She closed her hand and pressed it against the place where her ribs ached when she breathed too hard. "For them," he said, "and for you." She was not a woman to waste words. She nodded and shook her head at the same time and laughed once small and rough. She went inside and slipped the string over her neck. When the beads fell, they found the hollow at her throat and stayed there. The weather softened like an animal tamed by the same hand every day. The wind lost its knife and came up the valley with river on it instead of ice. Snow sank in on itself and went thin in strips under the south walls. The first nights where the cabin did not smoke at the eaves felt like a favor from a friend. Gideon opened the door at noon and let the air move through and carry out the smell of winter. He brought 2 saplings from the creek bottom, their roots wrapped in damp burlap. Aspen thin and brave and quick. He turned the soil with a spade and set them by the porch a little apart where they would find light. Lena held them straight while he tamped earth. The roots took and the leaves learned to tremble. The sound of those leaves in a small wind was silver and constant, a whisper the house began to expect. Travelers started to stop without asking if they might. A man from Missouri with a bedroll tied with baling twine slept in the stable and left a nail keg by the door in thanks. A couple out of Dakota who had lost their way to Montrose came up for water and left with bread and a story about a bridge made of logs that spun if you stepped wrong. Gideon repaired a harness clip for a teamster and would not take coin. Lena wrapped a child's foot in soft cloth where the boot had cut. The porch learned the sound of strangers' coughs and took them in. One evening, Gideon moved the coat on the peg, and the square of blue cloth fell to the floor again. It was always going to. He bent and picked it up. He had not meant to show it. He set it on the table and stood there with his hand on the back of the chair, as if the wood might tell him what to say. Lena dried the spoon and laid it beside the cloth. She lifted the square and unfolded it to the letter stitched in the corner in neat thread. R. She looked at it until the room got larger around them. Her name, he said, Rosalie. Lena's face did not change, but a small muscle by her eye moved and stopped. Did she leave you, or did you let her go? She left, he said. She liked a man who wore polish on his boots. I liked a man who did not live in me anymore. Lena folded the cloth back along the same crease and put it on the table. She set her hand on it and then moved her hand to his. Her fingers were warm and working. I was chosen by other people my whole life. I want choosing to mean something different now. He laid his palm over hers. The weight of it was slow and sure. You are here, he said. That is choosing. The apple crate by the hearth became a toy box without anyone saying it should. Ivy kept a pine cone in it and named it. May lined the rim with pebbles in a pattern she ruined and started again. Pearl found her feet and laughed at the idea. When they played in the yard, they returned to the porch with the smell of sun in their hair, and when they chattered, they filled the places winter had left empty. One afternoon, while Lena mended Gideon's coat in the shade, the girls ran to him with grass on their knees. Ivy grabbed his boot and looked up with eyes the color of the sky in snowmelt. She said a word she had not learned from anyone in the room. Pa. It surprised her as much as him. She laughed and said it again as if to be sure. Gideon bent and lifted her with his right arm and let May lean hard against his side while Pearl thumped his knee with an open hand. He did not smile big, but the set of his mouth loosened. He kissed the top of Ivy's head where hair met scalp and smelled dust and milk and light. Toward evening, he brought a plank of cedar to the steps and sat with his knife and the small brush he used for oil. He marked and cut and smoothed until the edges felt ready for a palm. He carved 3 flowers that were not any one thing but looked like they belonged here. He wiped the board with oil until the grain came forward like a map. He turned it over and cut 4 letters without flourish. Home. He hung it by the door where sun would find it in the morning and smoke would touch it at night. The house understood the sign because the pieces inside had already said it first. The fire burned a steady heart and did not snarl. The bell under the porch sat quiet on its hook unless a bird took it for a perch and then thought better. The aspen leaves told time in a soft voice. The names on the wall watched and kept their line. Lena sat on the step beside Gideon and let her shoulder lean against his. The bead string warmed against her skin. Her hand found his hand where it rested on his thigh and covered it. He spread his fingers and took her in like he took a tool he had made to fit. The silence did not need mending. The cabin held it and did not spill. When the light thinned to a good gold, he reached for a new strip of cedar and set the knife to it. The blade made a small sound each time it came toward him, a sound the house knew now, and kept like a secret that was only ever kind. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.